Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, let us set aside the familiar glow of nostalgia and step quietly into a version of the past that rarely makes it into postcards, sitcom reruns, or cheerful history books. When people talk about 1950s America, the images are usually warm and comforting: neat lawns, smiling families, shiny kitchens, and a sense that everything somehow made sense back then. It is often described as a golden age, a time when families were closer, values were clearer, and life moved at a steadier, safer pace. But history, like any old house, has rooms that are carefully kept out of sight. And tonight, we are going to open one of those doors. The 1950s American family is often remembered as a symbol of stability and success. The country had emerged from war victorious, the economy was growing, suburbs were expanding, and the idea of the perfect home became a powerful national dream. Advertisements promised happiness through appliances, order through routine, and fulfillment through clearly defined roles. Fathers went to work. Mothers stayed home. Children obeyed. Everything appeared to fit neatly into place. But appearances can be convincing, especially when an entire culture agrees not to look too closely. Behind the polished surfaces and cheerful slogans, many homes were built on a foundation of silence. Problems were not discussed openly. Emotions were not examined. Struggles were expected to be managed privately, quietly, and without complaint. The image of the happy family became not just an ideal, but an obligation. To admit that something was wrong was to risk judgment, shame, or social isolation. So instead, families learned to perform. They smiled at the right moments, spoke in careful tones, and followed routines that gave the impression of harmony, even when tension filled the air. This was a time when the concept of family values carried enormous weight, but those values often emphasized order and obedience over emotional safety or understanding. Conflict was seen as a failure, not an opportunity for growth. Asking for help was viewed as weakness. Keeping up appearances mattered more than addressing underlying pain. As a result, many households developed unspoken rules: certain topics were never raised, certain feelings were never named, and certain experiences were simply absorbed and endured. The idealized image of the 1950s family also left little room for complexity. Fathers were expected to be strong, controlled, and authoritative. Mothers were expected to be cheerful, patient, and endlessly capable. Children were expected to be polite, grateful, and resilient. When reality did not match these expectations, there was no language to address the gap. Instead, people adapted by minimizing, denying, or internalizing their struggles. Over time, this created homes that looked calm on the outside but felt tense and unpredictable within. What makes this period especially striking is how normalized the tension became. It was not seen as unusual to feel uneasy at home, to walk on eggshells, or to carefully monitor tone and behavior to avoid upsetting the balance. These experiences were rarely labeled as harmful. They were framed as part of growing up, part of marriage, part of life. The idea that home should be emotionally safe was not yet widely discussed. Stability mattered more than comfort. Control mattered more than communication. Popular culture played a powerful role in reinforcing this illusion. Television shows, advertisements, and magazines presented a version of family life where problems were small, temporary, and easily resolved. Parents disagreed politely. Children learned gentle lessons. Every story ended with reassurance. These images did not reflect reality for many families, but they shaped expectations all the same. When real life failed to resemble what was on screen, people assumed the problem was personal, not systemic. If your family did not look like the ones on television, the solution was not to question the image, it was to try harder to match it. This gap between appearance and reality created a kind of quiet isolation. People lived close together, yet felt alone in their experiences. Neighbors waved and exchanged pleasantries, but rarely asked meaningful questions. Communities valued privacy, which often translated into looking the other way. As long as things seemed orderly, there was little incentive to intervene or inquire further. Silence became a shared agreement, one that allowed everyone to maintain the comforting story of a stable, successful society. It is important to understand that this was not simply the result of individual choices. It was a cultural pattern reinforced by social norms, institutions, and expectations. Schools emphasized discipline and conformity. Religious spaces often promoted endurance and forgiveness over confrontation. Authorities prioritized maintaining order rather than addressing what happened behind closed doors. The message was consistent: keep things together, no matter the cost. For children growing up in this environment, the lessons were subtle but lasting. They learned to observe carefully, to sense shifts in mood, and to adjust their behavior accordingly. They learned which questions were safe and which were not. They learned that silence could be protective, and that drawing attention to problems could make things worse. These habits often followed them into adulthood, shaping how they approached relationships, conflict, and emotional expression long after the decade had passed. Looking back, it is easy to romanticize the 1950s because the surface details are so appealing. The fashion, the music, the design, the promise of simplicity. But history asks us to look deeper than aesthetics. It asks us to consider not just how things looked, but how they felt. And for many people, the reality of family life during this era was defined less by comfort and more by careful restraint. Understanding this does not mean dismissing the entire decade or ignoring moments of genuine warmth and connection that did exist. It means acknowledging that the story is more complicated than the version we were taught. It means recognizing that behind the image of the perfect home were real people navigating expectations that left little room for vulnerability or honesty. Tonight's story is not about blaming the past, but about seeing it clearly. Because when we understand how silence and appearances shaped family life in the 1950s, we gain insight into patterns that did not disappear overnight. Many of them echoed forward, influencing later generations in ways that are still being unpacked today. So as we move deeper into this quiet history, remember this: the most powerful myths are often the most comforting ones. And sometimes, the bravest thing history can do is tell us that things were not as simple as they seemed. As we move deeper into this story, it helps to focus not on dramatic moments, but on the ordinary ones. The kind that repeat every day, quietly shaping how people think, feel, and relate to one another. In many 1950s American homes, nothing captured this better than the morning routine, especially breakfast. On the surface, it was the most wholesome scene imaginable: a family gathered around the table, plates neatly arranged, the day beginning together. In reality, for many households, breakfast was less a moment of connection and more a carefully choreographed exercise in emotional awareness and restraint. The breakfast table was where the tone of the day was set. Everyone arrived already alert, already assessing. Children learned quickly that this was not a time for spontaneity. Words were chosen carefully, if spoken at all. Movements were quiet and controlled. Even eye contact could feel risky. A misplaced comment, a clink of silverware, or a question asked at the wrong moment could shift the atmosphere instantly. So the safest choice was often silence. This silence was not empty. It was dense with meaning. Children watched their father's posture, his expression, the way he held his coffee cup. Mothers listened for subtle changes in breathing or tone. Everyone became a student of mood. The goal was not warmth or conversation, but stability. Get through the meal without tension rising. Get through the meal without anyone losing patience. Get through the meal without starting the day on the wrong foot. In many homes, breakfast functioned almost like a test. If it passed smoothly, the day might be manageable. If it did not, everyone braced themselves for hours of unease. This gave the meal an outsized importance. It was not just about eating. It was about reading the room, predicting outcomes, and doing whatever was necessary to keep things calm. Over time, this turned ordinary family routines into quiet endurance exercises. What makes this especially striking is how normal it felt to the people living it. There was no language to describe this tension as unusual. Children did not compare notes. Parents did not question the structure. This was simply how mornings worked. Families believed that discomfort was part of discipline, and discipline was part of love. The idea that a meal could be emotionally unsafe did not register, because no alternative had been modeled. The rigid structure of the 1950s household played a major role here. Fathers were often seen as the emotional center of gravity, whether they intended to be or not. Their mood set the pace. If they were quiet, everyone else stayed quieter. If they were irritated, the table became still. Mothers worked hard to smooth things over, redirecting attention, refilling cups, or offering neutral conversation that would not provoke a response. Children learned that staying unnoticed was often the best strategy. This constant monitoring took a toll, especially on young minds. Breakfast, a moment that should have offered comfort and nourishment, instead reinforced the idea that safety depended on behavior. Hunger mixed with anxiety. Routine mixed with anticipation. Over time, these mornings taught children to associate closeness with caution and family togetherness with pressure. The table became a place of observation rather than expression. Outside the home, these families often appeared perfectly ordinary. Kids went to school neatly dressed. Parents exchanged polite greetings with neighbors. No one would have guessed that the calm image rested on such fragile balance. That is because the tension was internalized. It did not spill out in obvious ways. It lived in small habits, the way someone hesitated before speaking, the way chairs were pushed in quietly, the way laughter was restrained until the right moment. This pattern repeated day after day, slowly shaping personalities. Children became experts at anticipation. They learned to sense shifts before they happened. They learned which topics were safe and which were off limits. Over time, these skills were mistaken for maturity. A quiet child was seen as well-behaved. A compliant child was praised for being easy. Rarely did anyone ask what that compliance cost. Even the food itself became part of the ritual. Meals were expected to be eaten without complaint. Preferences were secondary to order. If you did not like what was served, you ate it anyway. This reinforced a broader lesson. Personal needs came after maintaining harmony. Expressing discomfort, even about something small, risked being seen as ungrateful or disruptive. So children learned to swallow more than just their food. Mothers, often carrying the emotional weight of the household, felt this tension just as acutely. Breakfast was another responsibility to manage perfectly. A burned piece of toast or a late start could feel like a personal failure. Many women internalized the belief that a smooth morning reflected their worth as homemakers and partners. If tension surfaced, it was often interpreted as something they had not prevented well enough. The repetition of these mornings mattered. One tense breakfast might fade from memory. Hundreds of them became a framework. They taught everyone involved that peace was fragile and had to be protected through constant effort. This made genuine relaxation rare. Even moments that appeared calm were maintained through vigilance rather than ease. What is important to understand is that this was not always intentional or malicious. Many parents believed they were doing the right thing. They had been raised in similar environments and knew no other model. Stability was valued above all else, and stability was defined by predictability and control. Emotional openness was risky because it introduced uncertainty. And uncertainty, in a culture shaped by war and rapid change, felt dangerous. Looking back, it is tempting to focus only on the extreme cases. But the quiet, everyday routines tell a deeper story. They reveal how tension can become normalized when it is woven into daily life. How people adapt without realizing what they are adapting to. And how something as simple as a shared meal can reflect the emotional architecture of an entire era. By understanding these ordinary moments, we begin to see how the image of the perfect 1950s family was maintained. Not through constant happiness, but through constant restraint. Not through open communication, but through careful avoidance. And as we continue, we will see how these small rituals shaped the emotional world of an entire generation, long after the breakfast dishes were cleared away. As the day moved on from those quiet, cautious breakfasts, the same rules followed everyone into every corner of the house. Silence was not just something practiced in the morning. It was a discipline that shaped the entire emotional rhythm of family life. In many 1950s homes, feelings were not something to be explored or discussed. They were obstacles to order. Sadness, frustration, fear, or confusion were seen as inconveniences at best, and signs of weakness at worst. So families learned, often without ever saying it aloud, that emotions were safest when kept hidden. Children absorbed this lesson early. Crying too much was labeled as being difficult. Asking too many questions was considered disrespectful. Showing anger was unacceptable unless you were the one in authority. Over time, kids learned to regulate not just their behavior, but their inner world. They practiced staying neutral, unreadable, agreeable. If something hurt, they learned to endure it quietly. If something felt unfair, they learned to accept it as normal. Silence became a kind of emotional armor. This emotional restraint was often praised. Adults would describe children as good, polite, or well-raised when they caused no trouble and asked for nothing. What went unnoticed was the cost of that praise. Children learned that love and approval were conditional, tied closely to how well they could suppress their own reactions. The message was subtle but consistent: your feelings matter less than keeping things calm. For parents, especially mothers, emotional suppression was framed as maturity and responsibility. Women were expected to manage not only the household, but the emotional temperature of everyone in it. Their own feelings were rarely given space. Fatigue, loneliness, and anxiety were brushed aside in favor of smiles and routines. Admitting emotional strain felt like failure, not honesty. So instead, many women learned to cope quietly, pushing through each day without language for what they were carrying. Men, on the other hand, were often discouraged from emotional expression in a different way. Vulnerability conflicted with cultural expectations of strength and control. Talking about fear or uncertainty was seen as unmanly. As a result, many men expressed stress indirectly, through silence, distance, or irritability. These reactions were rarely discussed openly. They simply became part of the household atmosphere, something everyone else adjusted around. What made this dynamic so powerful was how invisible it felt. Silence did not announce itself as a rule. It showed up in pauses, in unfinished sentences, in topics that were quietly avoided. Over time, family members stopped noticing how much they were not saying. Emotional restraint became automatic. It felt safer not to speak than to risk upsetting the fragile balance of the home. This culture of silence also meant that misunderstandings piled up without resolution. Small resentments went unspoken and slowly hardened. Children made sense of adult behavior on their own, often blaming themselves for tension they could not explain. Without open conversation, imagination filled the gaps, and those imagined explanations were often harsher than the truth. Outside the home, this emotional discipline was reinforced rather than challenged. Schools rewarded compliance and quietness. Religious teachings often emphasized patience, endurance, and self-control. Advice columns encouraged people to focus on gratitude and duty instead of dissatisfaction. There were few models for healthy emotional expression, and even fewer spaces where it felt safe to practice it. Over time, silence became mistaken for peace. A quiet house was assumed to be a happy one. A child who never complained was assumed to be thriving. But calm does not always mean comfort. In many homes, silence masked a constant effort to avoid conflict, an effort that required ongoing emotional labor from everyone involved. As these patterns repeated year after year, they shaped how people understood themselves. Many children carried this emotional restraint into adulthood, struggling to name their feelings or ask for support. They learned to minimize their own needs and prioritize stability over honesty. Relationships became places of careful negotiation rather than openness. Understanding this emotional landscape helps explain why the 1950s family could look so orderly while feeling so constrained. Silence was not accidental. It was a learned behavior, reinforced by culture and circumstance, and passed down quietly from one generation to the next. And as we continue forward, we will see how this silence interacted with authority, shaping power dynamics within the home and defining whose voice mattered, and whose was never meant to be heard. As silence settled into the daily rhythm of the household, authority quietly filled the space it created. In many 1950s American families, that authority centered almost entirely on the father. He was not just the provider or head of the household in a practical sense, but the emotional reference point around which everyone else oriented themselves. His presence, his tone, and especially his mood shaped the atmosphere of the home in ways that were rarely challenged and almost never discussed. This authority was not always loud or dramatic. In fact, it was often most powerful when it was subtle. A look, a pause, a change in posture could communicate more than words ever did. Children learned quickly to recognize these signals. They understood when to stay quiet, when to disappear into their rooms, and when it was safe to speak. The house seemed to breathe in response to him, tightening or relaxing depending on his state of mind. Questioning this dynamic was almost unthinkable. Cultural norms reinforced the idea that a father's word was final. Respect was defined as obedience, and obedience was framed as a moral value. Even when authority felt unpredictable or overwhelming, it was rarely labeled as such. It was simply how things were. Fathers were assumed to know best, and their behavior was often justified as discipline, stress from work, or the natural burden of responsibility. What made this especially difficult was the lack of emotional language around it. Children were not encouraged to talk about how authority felt to them. Fear, confusion, or discomfort were not recognized as meaningful responses. Instead, kids were expected to adapt, to grow up, to toughen up. In doing so, many learned to associate authority with unease rather than guidance, and respect with self-erasure rather than mutual understanding. Mothers often acted as buffers in this system, quietly managing the household in ways designed to minimize tension. They learned to anticipate reactions, to redirect conversations, to smooth over moments before they escalated. This invisible labor was rarely acknowledged. It was simply part of keeping the family functioning. In many ways, maintaining peace meant constantly adjusting around authority rather than engaging with it. The emotional weight of this dynamic accumulated over time. Children grew up measuring themselves against expectations that were rarely spoken but always present. Approval felt conditional, tied to behavior rather than connection. Mistakes carried emotional consequences that lingered long after the moment passed. And because this authority was normalized, few questioned whether it could be exercised differently. Outside the home, this structure was reinforced. Media portrayed fathers as firm but fair, strict but loving. Rarely did these portrayals explore the emotional impact of constant control or unpredictability. The message was clear: strong authority created strong families. Any discomfort caused along the way was seen as necessary, even character building. As these children became adults, many carried complicated feelings about authority into their own lives. Some replicated the model they knew, believing it was the only way to maintain order. Others avoided authority altogether, having learned to associate it with tension rather than safety. Either way, the emotional imprint remained. By understanding how authority operated inside the 1950s household, we begin to see how power and silence worked together. Authority filled the gaps left by suppressed emotion, and silence protected authority from being questioned. This combination shaped family life in profound ways, influencing not just behavior, but identity itself. And as we continue, we will see how this structure affected those expected to hold everything together quietly in the background, carrying emotional burdens that were rarely seen and even more rarely acknowledged. While fathers often set the emotional gravity of the household, mothers carried the invisible burden of keeping it all together. In the 1950s American home, women were expected to be the emotional caretakers, the stabilizers, the ones who ensured that daily life ran smoothly no matter what they themselves were feeling. From the outside, they were meant to look calm, capable, and content. Inside, many were quietly exhausted. The role of the mother was tightly defined. She was responsible for the home, the children, the meals, the schedules, and the emotional tone of the family. If something felt off, it was often assumed to be her responsibility to fix it. This expectation left very little room for vulnerability. Admitting overwhelm or dissatisfaction conflicted with the cultural ideal of the happy, fulfilled homemaker. So instead of speaking openly, many women learned to cope silently. Daily routines became both a refuge and a trap. Cleaning, cooking, organizing, and planning provided structure and a sense of control. A perfectly kept home offered proof, to others and to themselves, that they were doing their job well. But this constant activity also left little space to pause and reflect. Busyness became a way to avoid confronting deeper emotional strain. If you were always moving, always doing, you did not have to ask yourself how you felt. For many women, emotional distress was reframed as a personal weakness rather than a response to pressure. Instead of questioning the expectations placed on them, they questioned themselves. Fatigue became nerves. Sadness became stress. Anxiety became something to manage quietly, without disrupting the family. In this environment, medication was often presented as a solution not to change circumstances, but to help women continue functioning within them. These substances were widely accepted and rarely discussed openly. They were seen as tools that allowed women to remain composed, efficient, and pleasant. The goal was not healing or understanding, but maintenance. Keep the household running. Keep the mood light. Keep the image intact. Over time, this created a disconnect between appearance and experience that many women struggled to reconcile. Public image mattered deeply. Neighborhoods were close-knit, and comparison was constant. A well-dressed family, polite children, and an orderly home signaled success. Falling short of this image invited judgment. So mothers worked tirelessly to ensure that nothing appeared out of place. Guests saw smiles, not strain. Children were coached on manners. Problems stayed behind closed doors, carefully managed and rarely acknowledged. This emotional labor extended beyond the home. Social gatherings required performance. Conversations stayed pleasant and surface level. Complaints were minimized or turned into jokes. There was an unspoken understanding among many women, but little space to explore it honestly. Support existed, but it was often indirect, shared through hints rather than admissions. What is especially striking is how normalized this imbalance was. Women were praised for their endurance, their selflessness, their ability to put everyone else first. Rarely were they asked what that endurance cost them. The expectation was clear: Fulfillment came from service, and discomfort was something to be managed quietly. Children growing up in these homes absorbed this model. They saw their mothers constantly tending to others while neglecting themselves. They learned that care flowed outward, not inward. Emotional needs were secondary to responsibility. This shaped how many would later approach their own relationships, often struggling to balance giving and receiving. Understanding the mother's role in the 1950s household reveals how emotional strain was not just individual, but systemic. Women were placed at the center of family life without being given the tools or permission to care for themselves fully. Their composure was praised, but their silence was expected. As we move forward, we will see how children growing up in this environment learned to navigate a world where emotions were managed rather than expressed, and how these early lessons shaped their sense of safety, identity, and self-worth in ways that lasted long after childhood ended. Growing up inside this carefully controlled emotional environment, children adapted in ways that often went unnoticed by the adults around them. They became observers before they became participants. From a very young age, they learned that paying attention was not optional, it was necessary. The ability to sense a shift in mood, to recognize when silence meant danger or when calm was temporary, became a survival skill. These children did not need words to understand what was happening. They read the room the way others read books. This hyper-awareness developed gradually. At first, it might have looked like sensitivity or maturity. A child who stayed quiet, who anticipated needs, who avoided causing trouble was praised for being good. But beneath that label was a constant mental calculation. Is it safe to speak right now? Is it better to wait? Should I leave the room? Over time, these questions became automatic, running quietly in the background of every interaction. Staying invisible often felt like the safest choice. Children learned that drawing attention to themselves could disrupt the fragile balance of the household. Even positive attention could feel risky if it shifted the emotional focus. So they learned to take up as little space as possible. They played quietly. They kept their thoughts to themselves. They learned to disappear without physically leaving, becoming present in body but absent in voice. What is important to understand is that this was not taught through explicit instruction. No one sat children down and told them to suppress themselves. They learned by watching what happened when emotions surfaced. They noticed which reactions were welcomed and which were met with tension or withdrawal. Over time, they adjusted accordingly. This adjustment was intelligent and adaptive, but it came at a cost. By constantly monitoring others, children lost touch with their own inner signals. They became experts at understanding external emotions while remaining uncertain about their own. Feelings were something to manage in others, not something to explore within themselves. If they felt uneasy, they assumed it was their responsibility to fix it by behaving better, staying quieter, or asking for less. Tension became normal. A tight atmosphere was not alarming, it was familiar. Many children did not know what emotional ease felt like, so they did not miss it. They assumed that a sense of unease was part of family life, part of growing up. This normalization made it difficult to recognize later when something was truly wrong, because wrong felt ordinary. At school, these children often blended in. Teachers might describe them as attentive, polite, or mature beyond their years. Rarely did anyone ask why a child was so quiet, so careful, so reluctant to express needs. Emotional restraint was rewarded, not questioned. In this way, the outside world reinforced what children learned at home. Self-control mattered more than self-expression. As they grew older, this hypervigilance followed them into friendships and relationships. They became attuned to shifts in tone, quick to apologize, quick to accommodate. Conflict felt deeply uncomfortable, not because they lacked opinions, but because disagreement had always carried emotional weight. Many learned to smooth things over instinctively, even at their own expense. What is striking is how invisible this pattern remained. These children were not disruptive. They did not demand attention. They did not fit the image of someone in distress. And because of that, their internal world often went unseen. Their quiet competence masked the emotional labor they were constantly performing. Looking back, many would struggle to explain why certain situations made them anxious or why they felt responsible for other people's moods. The roots of those feelings were buried in countless small moments, the careful mornings, the unspoken rules, the learned instinct to disappear. These experiences shaped their sense of safety in ways that lasted long beyond childhood. By understanding how children adapted within the 1950s household, we begin to see that emotional survival did not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looked like silence. Sometimes it looked like compliance. Sometimes it looked like a child who never caused trouble and was praised for it. And as we continue, we will see how this quiet adaptation existed alongside a broader cultural acceptance of strict discipline, further reinforcing the idea that discomfort was not just normal but necessary. As these children grew older within households shaped by silence, authority, and emotional restraint, they also absorbed another unspoken truth: some things were never to be named. Harm, when it occurred, was rarely described directly. Instead, it was softened, minimized, or reframed in ways that made it easier to ignore. What happened inside the home stayed inside the home, protected by a shared agreement that certain realities were better left unexamined. In the 1950s, the idea of privacy held enormous power. A family's internal life was considered its own business, and crossing that boundary was seen as inappropriate. This belief did not just discourage outsiders from intervening. It discouraged family members from acknowledging problems even to themselves. If something felt wrong, the instinct was not to question it openly, but to explain it away. Stress from work. A bad day. A phase. A misunderstanding. Language became a tool for avoidance. Emotional harm was especially easy to dismiss because it left no visible mark. Harsh words could be justified as discipline. Prolonged coldness could be explained as mood. Fear could be reframed as respect. Without a shared vocabulary to describe emotional well-being, many experiences went unnamed. If there was no word for what you felt, it was difficult to believe it mattered. Even when harm became more visible, the response was often to look for ways to preserve normalcy rather than address the root cause. Apologies were rare, but excuses were plentiful. Moments of tension were followed by periods of calm, reinforcing the belief that things would simply settle down if left alone. This cycle created a sense of uncertainty that kept everyone alert but also hopeful that change might come without confrontation. Children were especially vulnerable to this pattern. They often blamed themselves for what they experienced, assuming that if they behaved better, stayed quieter, or tried harder, things would improve. Without reassurance or explanation, they filled in the gaps with self-criticism. The absence of acknowledgement made it harder to trust their own perceptions. If no one else reacted, maybe nothing was wrong. If no one spoke about it, maybe it was not real. Public image played a crucial role in maintaining this denial. Families worked hard to appear respectable. Clothes were clean, manners were polite, and conversation stayed light. Any crack in that image felt dangerous. Admitting problems risked gossip, judgment, or social isolation. So maintaining appearances became a priority, sometimes even more important than addressing what was happening behind closed doors. This pressure extended beyond the family itself. Neighbors noticed things, but rarely commented. Friends sensed tension, but did not ask questions. There was a collective understanding that everyone had their struggles, and that discussing them openly was improper. Silence became communal, not just individual. It allowed everyone to coexist without challenging the comforting belief that most families were doing just fine. What is striking is how effective this system was at protecting itself. The lack of open discussion meant there were few reference points for comparison. If your home felt tense, you assumed that was normal. If you felt afraid or confused, you assumed that was part of growing up. Without alternative examples, it was difficult to imagine a different way of living. This culture of denial did not require cruelty to function. It thrived on discomfort, avoidance, and the desire to belong. People were not necessarily trying to cause harm. They were trying to maintain stability in a world that valued order above all else. But in doing so, they allowed patterns of emotional harm to continue unchallenged. Over time, this silence shaped how an entire generation understood relationships. Problems were something to endure, not resolve. Pain was something to hide, not heal. Strength was defined by how much you could carry without showing it. These beliefs did not disappear when the decade ended. They lingered, passed quietly from parents to children, woven into expectations about marriage, family, and responsibility. By recognizing how denial operated in everyday life, we begin to understand why so many experiences from this era went unspoken for so long. It was not that people did not feel pain. It was that the culture offered them no safe way to acknowledge it. And as we continue, we will see how this silence was reinforced not only at home, but by broader social norms that framed strict discipline as virtue and suffering as character building rather than something to be questioned. Within this broader culture of silence and denial, strict physical discipline fit easily into everyday life, not as something shocking, but as something expected. In the 1950s, many families viewed corporal punishment as a necessary tool for raising children properly. It was discussed openly in terms of teaching lessons, building character, or correcting behavior, rarely questioned as a practice, and almost never examined for its emotional impact. Because it was framed as normal and even virtuous, it blended seamlessly into the household structure already shaped by authority and restraint. Children grew up understanding that discipline was not just about rules but about power. When boundaries were crossed, consequences were swift and unquestioned. There was little room for explanation or discussion. The lesson was simple: authority did not need to justify itself. Obedience was the goal, not understanding. Over time, this taught children that compliance mattered more than curiosity, and fear could be an effective motivator. What made this normalization especially powerful was how widely it was reinforced. Parents spoke about it casually with other parents. Teachers were permitted to use physical punishment in schools. Religious teachings often emphasized correction and submission as moral duties. These messages aligned perfectly, creating a unified cultural stance. Strict discipline was not only acceptable, it was responsible. Anyone who questioned it risked being seen as permissive or weak. Because of this, children rarely felt they could talk about their experiences. There was no sense that what they felt was unusual or worthy of concern. If punishment hurt or felt confusing, the assumption was that it was deserved. This belief shaped how children understood responsibility. Mistakes became moral failures rather than opportunities to learn. Shame replaced guidance, and fear replaced trust. The emotional impact of this approach was subtle but lasting. Children learned to associate authority with threat rather than protection. They became careful not because they understood consequences, but because they wanted to avoid discomfort. Over time, this discouraged open communication. Why explain yourself if the outcome was already decided? Why express confusion if it would be dismissed? For parents, corporal punishment was often inherited rather than chosen. Many were simply repeating what they had experienced themselves. It was familiar, culturally supported, and rarely questioned. In a society that valued order and predictability, it offered a clear, immediate way to enforce rules. The long-term emotional effects were not part of the conversation. This approach also reinforced emotional distance. Discipline was something done to children, not something done with them. There was little emphasis on dialogue, repair, or reassurance afterward. Once the moment passed, it was expected to be forgotten. But children remembered. Even if they could not articulate it, the experience shaped how safe they felt expressing themselves in the future. As these children grew older, many internalized the idea that discomfort was an acceptable price for order. Some came to believe that love and pain could coexist without contradiction. Others learned to separate obedience from trust, doing what was required without feeling emotionally connected. These patterns influenced how they later approached authority in workplaces, relationships, and their own parenting. What is important to recognize is that this normalization did not exist in isolation. It worked alongside silence, denial, and rigid roles, reinforcing the same lesson from multiple directions: do not question, do not complain, and do not expect explanation. Together, these forces created a childhood environment where control was visible, but understanding was scarce. By examining how corporal punishment was woven into everyday life, we gain insight into how deeply cultural norms can shape what a society considers acceptable. It reminds us that practices can be widespread without being harmless, and familiar without being healthy. And as we continue, we will see how institutions beyond the home helped sustain these norms, reinforcing them with authority and legitimacy that made them even harder to challenge. Beyond the walls of the home, the same values that shaped family life in the 1950s were reinforced by the institutions people trusted most. Churches, schools, and law enforcement were widely seen as moral anchors of society, places meant to guide, protect, and correct. Yet in practice, these institutions often strengthened the very dynamics that kept silence, authority, and denial firmly in place. Rather than challenging harmful patterns, they frequently validated them, framing endurance as virtue and conformity as stability. In many religious settings, messages centered on obedience, patience, and forgiveness. Families were encouraged to stay together at all costs, to endure hardship quietly, and to see personal suffering as a test of character or faith. Openly discussing family conflict was often discouraged, not out of cruelty, but out of a belief that harmony mattered more than honesty. Problems were expected to be resolved privately through prayer, self-reflection, or quiet endurance, rather than through open dialogue or outside support. Schools echoed similar values. Classrooms emphasized discipline, order, and respect for authority. Children were rewarded for compliance and punished for disruption, regardless of what might have been happening in their lives outside of school. A quiet child was seen as a good student. A child who followed rules without question was praised. Rarely did educators look beneath behavior to understand emotional well-being. The system was not designed to ask why a child was withdrawn, tense, or overly eager to please. It was designed to maintain order. When children carried the emotional weight of their homes into the classroom, it often went unnoticed or misunderstood. Difficulty concentrating might be labeled as laziness. Emotional withdrawal might be seen as shyness. There was little awareness that a child's behavior could be shaped by chronic tension at home. As long as rules were followed, deeper questions were rarely asked. Law enforcement played a similar role in reinforcing boundaries around family privacy. Domestic matters were widely considered personal issues, not public concerns. Intervening in family conflict was often seen as inappropriate unless something extreme occurred. The goal was to restore surface calm, not to examine underlying patterns. Advice might be offered, but follow-up was rare. The assumption was that families knew how to handle their own problems. This approach sent a powerful message: what happens at home stays at home. It discouraged people from seeking help and reassured those in authority that their behavior would not be questioned. It also reinforced the belief that stability mattered more than safety, and that preserving appearances was a social responsibility. Together, These institutions created a consistent cultural framework. At home, authority was unquestioned. At school, compliance was rewarded. In church, endurance was praised. In the community, privacy was protected above all else. There was no obvious place to turn where emotional harm could be named without judgment or consequence. Silence was not just personal, it was institutional. For individuals growing up in this environment, the message was clear and repetitive. Do not disrupt. Do not complain. Do not challenge authority. Trust the system, even when it does not feel safe. Over time, many internalized this message so deeply that they stopped imagining alternatives. The way things were felt inevitable. Looking back, it becomes clear that these institutions were not necessarily acting out of malice. They were products of the same cultural values that shaped families. They prioritized order in a world still recovering from war and uncertainty. But in doing so, they helped sustain patterns that left little room for emotional truth or accountability. Understanding this broader context helps explain why change was so slow to come. When silence is reinforced at every level of society, breaking it feels not just risky, but wrong. And as we move forward, we will see how popular media added yet another layer to this illusion, presenting comforting stories that masked reality and made the gap between appearance and experience even wider. By the time evening arrived in many 1950s American homes, the day's unspoken tensions had not disappeared. They had simply settled, becoming quieter, more contained. Dinner was cleared, children prepared for bed, and the family gathered in the living room around one of the most powerful new objects of the era, the television. This glowing box quickly became a centerpiece of domestic life, promising relaxation, connection, and a shared experience at the end of the day. But what it truly offered was something deeper and far more influential, a carefully constructed fantasy of what family life was supposed to look like. Television sitcoms of the 1950s presented households that felt reassuringly simple. Fathers were firm but gentle, mothers were endlessly patient and cheerful, and children were mischievous yet well-meaning. Problems arose, but they were always small, always solvable, and always wrapped up neatly within half an hour. Disagreements ended in smiles. Lessons were learned quickly. No tension lingered past the closing credits. For families watching at home, this version of reality felt comforting but also quietly unsettling. These shows did not just entertain, they educated. They taught viewers what normal looked like. They modeled how parents should speak, how children should behave, and how conflict should resolve. And because television reached into millions of homes simultaneously, it created a shared cultural script. Even families whose private lives felt nothing like what they saw on screen absorbed these images as benchmarks, standards they were expected to meet. For parents, sitcoms reinforced existing expectations. Fathers saw portrayals of calm authority, where respect came naturally and guidance was met with understanding. Mothers saw images of domestic grace, where homemaking was fulfilling and emotional strain was almost non-existent. These portrayals left little room for exhaustion, resentment, or uncertainty. When real life failed to match the screen, many parents assumed the problem lay within themselves, not with the unrealistic image they were being shown. Children, too, internalized these stories. They saw families where parents listened patiently, where children could speak freely without fear of upsetting the balance. They saw homes where warmth was expressed openly and mistakes led to gentle lessons rather than tension. But when they looked up from the television and back into their own living rooms, the contrast was stark. What they experienced did not match what they were told was normal. This disconnect created confusion rather than clarity. Children did not necessarily reject the television version of family life. Instead, they assumed it was real, just not for them. If other families were happy and open and calm, then the difference must be personal. Maybe their own family was failing. Maybe they themselves were doing something wrong. Television did not expose the problem. It disguised it by suggesting that the ideal already existed everywhere else. What made sitcoms especially powerful was their tone. They were gentle, humorous, and reassuring. They did not deny that problems existed. They simply minimized them. Conflict was portrayed as temporary and harmless. Emotional discomfort was resolved through understanding rather than endurance. This framing made it harder to recognize deeper issues in real life. If problems were supposed to resolve so easily, then ongoing tension felt abnormal but also unspeakable. Television also encouraged avoidance. After a long day of managing emotions, following rules, and maintaining appearances, families could sit quietly together and focus on something external. There was comfort in shared laughter, even if it was directed at fictional characters. Watching TV allowed families to be together without needing to talk to one another. It filled the room with sound, reducing the pressure of conversation and the risk of saying the wrong thing. In this way, television became both a bonding tool and a barrier. Families gathered physically, but not emotionally. The screen offered connection without vulnerability. It allowed people to relax without addressing what lay beneath the surface. Over time, this pattern reinforced the idea that togetherness did not require honesty, just proximity. The influence of these shows extended beyond the living room. They shaped how people talked about family life in public. References to sitcom families became shorthand for happiness and success. Comparing one's home to what was seen on television became a quiet habit, even if no one admitted it aloud. The more these images circulated, the more they defined what was acceptable to discuss and what was better left unsaid. Importantly, sitcoms rarely showed emotional complexity. Parents did not struggle with long-term stress. Children did not carry anxiety from one episode to the next. Everyone reset at the end of each story. This reset reinforced the illusion that emotional pain was temporary and easily resolved. It left no space for the idea that some feelings linger, or that some problems require more than a single conversation to address. For those living in homes marked by silence or tension, this created an added layer of isolation. Not only did they lack language to describe their experiences, but the dominant cultural narrative suggested that such experiences were rare. If television families could solve everything so quickly, why could not theirs? This question lingered quietly, unanswered. Over time, the gap between public ideal and private reality widened. Families worked harder to appear normal, to match the image they saw reflected back at them from the screen. Laughter in the living room did not always mean comfort. Sometimes it meant relief from having to speak. The television became a symbol of harmony, even when harmony was only surface deep. Looking back, it is easy to dismiss these shows as harmless entertainment. But their impact was cumulative. They did not create the emotional restraint of the 1950s, but they reinforced it. They offered a vision of family life that felt achievable yet remained just out of reach. And by doing so, they helped maintain the silence that surrounded real emotional struggle. Understanding the role of television in this era helps explain why so many people remember the 1950s as peaceful despite the tension that existed behind closed doors. The stories people told themselves and each other were shaped by what they saw on screen. And when those stories felt comforting enough, there was little incentive to question them. In the end, these sitcoms did not just reflect culture. They helped preserve it. They gave people a version of family life that felt safe to believe in, even if it was not true. And sometimes, the most powerful myths are not the ones that frighten us, but the ones that gently reassure us that everything is already exactly as it should be. As the 1950s progressed, the pressure to maintain appearances intensified. It was no longer enough to simply be a functional family. There was an unspoken expectation to resemble the flawless images circulating in magazines, on billboards, and through television screens. This pressure manifested subtly but pervasively, shaping behavior in ways that were difficult to resist or even recognize. Families learned quickly that deviation from the norm, anger expressed too openly, tears shed too freely, or disagreement voiced too forcefully was met with social disapproval, judgment, or silent criticism. The consequences were less immediate than punishment. They were more insidious, a growing sense that emotional authenticity itself was undesirable. Children absorbed these lessons early. They noticed the faint lines of tension that parents tried to hide, the sighs stifled behind smiles, the conversations that never fully happened. Over time, they learned that speaking up could disrupt the fragile equilibrium, and the safer path was to internalize emotions. Fear, disappointment, sadness, or frustration were quietly filed away, leaving a residue of unresolved feelings. Many grew into adults accustomed to suppressing vulnerability, believing that showing emotion was a form of weakness rather than an opportunity for connection. This dynamic often perpetuated cycles of silence, as children raised in this environment unknowingly adopted the same habits with their own offspring. The pressure was amplified by the broader community. Neighbors, church members, and extended family all contributed to a culture where deviation from societal norms, especially within the family, was met with subtle policing. People measured themselves against one another, comparing homes, behaviors, and even daily routines. The most mundane actions became statements about morality, competence, and love. Public appearances mattered immensely, while private struggles were discouraged or dismissed entirely. In such an environment, emotional honesty was not just undervalued. It was actively discouraged, leading to an invisible but powerful social enforcement of restraint. Media played a reinforcing role. Beyond sitcoms, advertisements, lifestyle columns, and parenting guides all projected the same ideals: a harmonious family, content children, and composed parents. The repetition of these images created a feedback loop, where societal expectations and media portrayals mutually reinforced one another. Individuals rarely saw examples of how ordinary families navigated conflict, disappointment, or emotional complexity. Instead, they were bombarded with polished images that suggested happiness was straightforward, achievable, and constant. When reality inevitably fell short, the gap was felt keenly, fostering guilt, shame, and self-doubt. This climate of emotional suppression had profound consequences. Problems that might have been addressed through conversation, empathy, or shared effort were often ignored. Marital disagreements simmered in private. Sibling rivalries went unmediated. Children's anxieties were internalized. The absence of open communication meant that misunderstandings multiplied quietly, and small tensions became long-standing patterns. Families often operated as functional units on the surface, but beneath that functionality lay a network of unspoken grievances, unmet needs, and unprocessed emotions. The cultural emphasis on conformity also shaped gendered expectations. Fathers were expected to remain stoic and authoritative, rarely revealing vulnerability. Mothers were expected to be endlessly nurturing, managing both household responsibilities and the emotional well-being of everyone else. Children were expected to be obedient, cheerful, and compliant. Any deviation risked criticism or social ostracism. These roles were not merely suggestions, they were enforced by the subtle yet omnipresent gaze of society. Failure to embody them accurately was not just a personal shortcoming but a visible breach of collective norms, a reminder to the family and the community of what proper domestic life should look like. Religious and educational institutions reinforced the same messages. Church teachings promoted moral virtue linked to self-control and composure, often framing emotional restraint as evidence of character. Schools rewarded children who conformed socially, discouraging those who expressed anger, defiance, or sadness. These institutions created overlapping layers of expectation, leaving little space for genuine emotional exploration. Individuals internalized these norms over years, learning to equate emotional expression with impropriety, embarrassment, or social risk. The result was a paradoxical environment. Families were physically close and socially visible, yet emotionally distant. Love and care existed, but they were often expressed through action rather than dialogue. Meals were prepared, houses were kept, and rules were enforced, but conversations about feelings were rare. Children learned to read body language, gestures, and coded signals rather than relying on verbal affirmation. While this fostered a certain kind of resilience and attentiveness, it also entrenched a culture of unspoken tension, leaving long-term psychological effects that would surface later in life. Moreover, the internalization of emotions was not uniform. It varied with personality, family structure, and circumstance. Some individuals found subtle outlets for expression through writing, art, or private reflection, while others buried their feelings entirely. The disparity created invisible rifts between those who could adapt emotionally and those who could not. In turn, these gaps influenced how children interacted with their peers, teachers, and eventually their own families, perpetuating cycles of restraint and avoidance. Emotional suppression became both a personal coping mechanism and a social imperative, deeply ingrained and widely transmitted. Despite the challenges, it is important to recognize that this culture of restraint also had perceived benefits. Families avoided public embarrassment, conflict rarely escalated to destructive levels, and social cohesion remained largely intact. The ability to present a calm, orderly front was valued as a hallmark of competence and maturity. However, these advantages came at a cost. The internal lives of family members often remained unacknowledged, unresolved, and sometimes invisible to those closest to them. In essence, the social pressure to conform to idealized family norms created an intricate web of expectations and constraints. Families learned to prioritize appearances over authenticity, harmony over honesty, and propriety over emotional exploration. This dynamic shaped daily interactions, parenting practices, and personal development, leaving a legacy that extended far beyond the immediate household. By discouraging honest emotional expression, the culture of the 1950s cultivated both a sense of stability and a hidden undercurrent of tension, influencing the ways in which love, authority, and identity were experienced and understood. The influence of this pressure persists in subtle ways even today. Many people still carry the inherited belief that emotions should be managed carefully, displayed selectively, and contained within socially acceptable boundaries. The echoes of a decade that prized perfection, restraint, and conformity continue to affect how individuals communicate, parent, and relate to one another. Understanding this context allows us to see how the ideals of the 1950s, reinforced by both social norms and media portrayals, shaped not only the visible structure of family life but also its hidden emotional landscape, leaving lessons and challenges that remain relevant in contemporary discussions about childhood, parenting, and emotional well-being. Looking back at the 1950s, we can start to see how the combination of societal pressure, media influence, and idealized family imagery created a framework that deeply affected children's development. Children raised in this era were growing up in a world that prioritized conformity and appearances above emotional authenticity. They were expected to obey, excel, and maintain a pleasant demeanor, often without opportunities to explore or articulate their feelings fully. This had long-term consequences. Many children learned to internalize stress, anxiety, and frustration, carrying these unresolved emotions into adulthood. The lessons they absorbed about discipline and self-control influenced not just their own behavior but also how they later interacted with peers, colleagues, and eventually their own children. Parents of the era were navigating a complicated landscape themselves. They were trying to meet societal expectations, often without clear guidance or models for emotional intelligence. Advice columns, parenting manuals, and television shows offered prescriptive norms rather than empathetic guidance, emphasizing order, discipline, and propriety over understanding and dialogue. Mothers, in particular, faced enormous pressure to maintain both the household and their children's emotional well-being, while fathers were socially encouraged to remain distant figures of authority. This division often left families with unbalanced emotional dynamics, where children might feel seen in terms of behavior and achievement but not necessarily understood emotionally. The generational echo of these patterns was profound, affecting parenting strategies, family communication, and personal relationships for decades to come. Analyzing this context also illuminates broader cultural attitudes. The emphasis on control, order, and conformity created a culture where vulnerability and emotional exploration were undervalued. This had implications beyond individual households. It shaped schools, workplaces, and social expectations. Emotional restraint was considered a virtue. Those who struggled to conform were often stigmatized or labeled as problematic. Children growing up under these norms were learning to navigate a world that rewarded compliance and composure while subtly punishing authenticity. Over time, these cultural attitudes became embedded, influencing national conceptions of childhood, discipline, and emotional development. Understanding the historical context also provides insight into the evolution of parenting philosophies. The 1950s marked a particular moment in American history when rapid post-war change, suburbanization, and media proliferation converged to create a very specific vision of family life. This vision, though idealized and often unattainable, was incredibly influential, shaping generations of parents and children. By examining these influences, we can better understand why certain approaches to discipline, emotional expression, and family structure persisted long after the decade ended. We can also see the seeds of change, as later decades began to question strict authority, explore the importance of emotional intelligence, and reconsider the balance between structure and flexibility in parenting. The lessons of this era are not purely historical. They continue to resonate today. Modern parenting debates, psychological research, and cultural conversations often reference or react to the legacies of the 1950s. Understanding the pressures and norms of the past allows us to contextualize contemporary discussions about childhood, discipline, and emotional development. We can appreciate how certain beliefs such as the importance of self-control, respect for authority, or the value of composure originated in specific historical conditions, and how they may conflict with more recent insights into the psychological needs of children. This awareness equips parents, educators, and society at large to navigate the balance between guidance and empathy, discipline and understanding, expectation and acceptance. Reflecting on the 1950s also prompts us to consider the diversity of experiences that existed beneath the surface of the idealized image. Not all families fit the mold. Not all children internalized emotions in the same way. And not all parents adhered strictly to societal prescriptions. Yet, the cultural narrative of perfection and harmony was so dominant that it overshadowed many of these variations, creating a kind of invisible standard that shaped behavior even when reality was different. By studying this era with nuance, we can recognize both the pressures and the resilience of families who navigated these expectations. And we can better understand how culture and social norms interact with individual experience. Ultimately, examining the parenting norms of the 1950s reveals how deeply culture shapes childhood and development. It shows how societal ideals reinforced by media, education, and social expectation can influence daily life, family dynamics, and long-term emotional patterns. By understanding this history, we gain perspective on the complex interplay between external pressures and internal experience, between conformity and individuality, and between discipline and emotional growth. We can see that the effects of past norms are not simply relics. They continue to influence our attitudes toward childhood, parenting, and emotional expression today. The story of the 1950s family is, in many ways, a story about learning, adaptation, and negotiation. It is about how individuals respond to expectations, how they internalize lessons about behavior and emotion, and how those lessons echo across generations. Appreciating this history allows us to critically examine our current approaches to parenting and childhood, to recognize the lingering influence of past ideals, and to make more informed choices that prioritize emotional well-being alongside discipline and responsibility. Understanding where we come from, in terms of cultural norms and societal expectations, empowers us to create environments where children can grow with both structure and the freedom to express themselves authentically, ensuring that the lessons of history inform but do not constrain the possibilities of today. In conclusion, exploring the parenting norms and cultural expectations of the 1950s gives us a deeper understanding of how past generations were shaped and, in turn, how they shape the world we live in today. It reveals the complex interplay between societal pressures, family dynamics, and individual development, showing us how ideas about discipline, emotional expression, and childhood were formed and passed down. By reflecting on this history, we not only gain insight into the challenges and resilience of families from that era but also learn valuable lessons about how to approach parenting, childhood, and emotional growth in the present. Appreciating the past allows us to make more conscious choices, fostering environments where children can thrive emotionally while still learning responsibility and self-discipline. The story of the 1950s family serves as both a cautionary tale and a source of wisdom, reminding us that culture, expectation, and love are all intertwined in shaping the human experience. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through history and parenting. I hope this discussion gives you a new perspective on how much our past influences our present and future. See you in the next story.